This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin with our weekly grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. He provides the latest information on futures and cash markets, and then goes on to list the percentages of crops currently affected by drought in Kansas. Also ahead, inspired by recent weather activity earlier this week, K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond walks us through different winter weather types. He explains that even differences in snow types can alter the impact they have on our agricultural soils. We end with Chip continuing on with this week's agricultural weather report. He shares insight on precipitation received across large amounts of the state earlier this week, where we currently stand on average snowfall this time of year, and what we can expect in February and onward. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are starting today's programming with our K-State grain economist, Dan O'Brien, for our grain market update this week. So first and foremost, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Hello, Samantha.
Well, Dan, we're going to start as we usually do with futures, and it hasn't been too crazy of a week, but coming off of reports last week.
Yeah, the major set of USDA reports were on Thursday, January the 12th. So yesterday's market closes. We're 1 week from then. And generally since that time, we've had some ups and downs, but overall, corn market responded positively. It was down on Thursday, 4 cents down to 677 and a quarter, but generally it trends higher. And we talk a lot about the relative strength index, and it's on the positive side of 50, so 55, 52, 56, whatever had gotten higher. So corn generally looking on the positive side. For wheat, wheat ended up closing yesterday at 832, down 9 cents, still pretty volatile, still quite up and down. So since that report, we traded higher and came back just about to where we were a week ago. Not a lot of change. I still think that the bigger, broader issues that the wheat market will have to deal with are still out in front of us in terms of drought and what finally transpires overseas in the Black Sea region, as Russia has a lot of wheat, trouble getting it out of the country, and Ukraine doesn't have much, but trying to get it out of the country. So got that. And I would say for soybeans, we closed yesterday at $15.14 and a quarter. That was down 9. But generally, since that report, we traded up to the high side, up to about 15 on the high side, about 15.50, and are back down to 15.14, really not far from where we were a week ago. So overall, I guess if you're an optimist, the reports didn't cause the bottom to fall out. So that's one way to look at it. And it did cause us move it to the high side. I know my good friend and colleague Guys talked in recent days about the drought in Argentina and that's occurred and the impact it has on global movements. I would add that in the last few days, there's hardly been any news that has lessened that impact. And it just seems like that if there's a surprise on the market this year that's coming in giving us underlying support in the grains, it's that Argentina has fallen short with drought, and it affects and will probably eventually affect U.S. corn exports, for sure, U.S. soybean exports. We're still waiting on some of those effects, but there are gaps in time out there in those marketing years before the Brazilian crop comes in that they'll have to come to the U.S. if they're going to move anything. So that's a big deal. So that's the futures. I would say on the cash side in Kansas, we generally are still holding up decently. Of course, you're always affected by where you're at the most. I'm here in Northwest Kansas, and some of the premier bids in the Northwest area have softened about 25 to 30 cents. And they're still 75 cents over, but they're not $1.06 anymore. So that's something to think about. Garden City bids still strong at $1.30 over at 807 on yesterday's closes. You still have strong bids in Southeast Kansas in terms of the areas we watch. Southeast Kansas around the Columbus and within 30, 40 miles. The highest bids there are $1 over. So they're the second highest bids in the state. Salina, 75 over. Now they're just marching pretty close to where the Colby bid is at. Topeka at 51 over. And Hutchinson doing quite well also at 90 over. So all pretty good. The new crop bids in corn haven't changed a lot. The strongest of them, of course, is the Garden City area at 45 over. But the Hutchinson bid, even money, at $5.96 for Dees delivery, and other places running 20 to 30 under across the state. So interesting to watch. I guess in quick summary, sorghum bids still doing decently. Well, for instance, in the Garden City market, such a bellwether for us, $1.30 over for corn, basis at 807 for grain sorghum, 717, 40 over. 40 over is still a great bid, but not as strong as for corn. I would say for new crop bids, it is interesting to see that in the Topeka area that the new crop forward contract bid for sorghum is equal to corn. So that at 566, that's interesting. Only trails by a dime in Salina, 566 versus 576, about 15 cents lower in Colby. So we're lining up to make our final planting decisions for this year. And in a lot of the drier, in areas that are dealing with drought for non-irrigated crops in particular, they'll be deciding between corn and grain sorghum. And to me, it's interesting in some of those areas that where particularly you have the corn and sorghum new crop bids not that far apart. It probably gives more incentive than there might be otherwise to actually consider sorghum along with corn and what people might do. Just so much depends on how much moisture they have and how much fortune they've had growing these crops in the past. I would say for soybeans, just all over the board. The strongest soybean bids in the state, Topeka, 1530 at 15 over, and Hutchinson at 17 over. And again, Columbus area, 11 over for basis. Again, Salina even money, and then out to the west, Colby, 65 under, Garden City at 25 under for the cash bids. So there's still a thirst in the markets for beans, either to crush. By the way, it's kind of the ongoing big news is that we crush a lot of soybeans and meal's being used, and we're producing renewable diesel. A lot of these plants also, so they're both coming into play. New crop bids, a lot of variability. The best of them, the strongest basis bids, 1309 in Salina and Hutchinson, Columbus area, just trailing by about a nickel. Topeka also 1309. That who does trail in that would be out to the west where we're at. And for wheat, so here we're talking about all these other crops that we haven't planted yet. The ones we do have in the field, wheat, cash bids ranging across the state from the low end at 806 in Topeka. Yesterday in particular, Garden City about 807, 801, in Colby. And then on the high side, 818, 817 in Hutchinson, Salina, and Central Park. So still doing pretty good. The wheat export numbers, just so-so, just decent, a little bit of a recent uptick, but still below the pace to meet even the lowered USDA projections for exports. And then finally, for new crop bids, in most farmers' minds, it's not what they have now. They probably sold their wheat, a good number of them. It's what they will get at harvest. And 768, 778, 783, 788, 755, those type of numbers. We're looking at our cost of production numbers out of KSU, and generally, when we don't have fallow periods involved, if we're just continuous cropping, we don't have extra land costs to cover fallow, then you're making a decent amount of money on wheat. When you have a fallow period, you're still making some money, but it does get crunched as you just have more land to try to cover. So you stand back and look at our profitability prospects, which we've been doing in some recent corn meetings and some other conferences. And in most cases, well, especially for most of the dry land crops, we're making money on the irrigated crops. For corn, for soybeans in particular, we're really making quite a bit of money at these new crop bids. And I should say, when I present those numbers to farmers, they say, boy, that looks great. There's money there. Now, if we just can get the bushels, we'll be happy. And that's the challenge, is with the dry conditions that we're looking at this year, then how proactive or how aggressive are they in their marketing actions when there's such uncertainty in their minds about the underlying moisture in the soil?
Challenge there for sure. And we're going to talk further about drought now, Dan, if that's okay with you, and kind of how that plays out for the main crops that we see here in the U.S. If you want to talk through that now, those numbers with us, let's do that. That sounds good. Of course, our climatologists at KSU have talked about the thought that La Nina would be lessening to at least neutral, if not El Nino coming on, and that may give us more moisture. For winter wheat, the front crop that's coming nationally, by the time you add soft red winter wheat and hard red all together, east and west, 59% of winter wheat is in the U.S. is experiencing drought. You come to Kansas, our numbers, 50% of our wheat acres are in exceptional drought, 20
in extreme drought, another 14 in severe drought, and we have at least 5% in only moderate drought. So dry conditions. Now, moisture has just been coming into western Kansas. That helps some. We have a long ways to go to replenish soil profiles. So we're concerned about winter wheat. Would just say quickly for corn, if you look at Kansas, very similar numbers, 45% of the corn production area in the state in exceptional drought, another 14 in extreme. In Kansas, for sorghum, there is at least, again, just like wheat, 4% of the area we grow sorghum in the state has only moderate drought. Everything else is worse. So we are definitely waiting on moisture there. And for soybeans in Kansas, we're more eastern part of the state oriented. And 17% in exceptional drought, another 14 in extreme. So still awfully dry. Beans would be impacted as well. And for cotton in the state, since we're talking about these just to be complete, in Kansas, 95% of the area we grow cotton in Kansas, that southern part, all in exceptional drought. So cotton's a drought-hardy crop. We do have sunflowers in the state, too. Well, a combination of 67% in either exceptional or extreme drought. So we stand back and look at all that, and we have a tremendous year in front of us, price-wise, it would seem, if we can just grow crops. I do think that upshot of this is if we get into this year and we don't replenish soil moisture, and it looks like we may have dry conditions coming on, then I really would wonder what corn basis, in particular, and sorghum basis will do during the summer months if we start getting worried about that next crop. It'd just be a really opportune time, a really blessed time if we got some moisture this spring and had at least average crop yield. It would turn a lot around financially out here in western Kansas and across the state.
That it would. And it's interesting going into, as people start planning for what they're going to be planting going into the spring and through summer and things like that. It's interesting to see how this drought or prices, considerations, things like that are affecting producers' decisions with what they are or not going to be planting. So it'll be interesting to watch those acreage numbers change as time goes on, and we'll be watching that for sure. But as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Samantha. Take care.
Once again, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us for this week's grain market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're joined now by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond for a conversation on winter weather types. And Chip, I think listeners are used to hearing you later in the program today, but we figured we'd do this segment in light of recent events just to put some information out there for folks.
A great weather double feature.
There you go, a double feature on a Friday. So, like I said, we were inspired by this week's weather system that we experienced across the state on Wednesday. So let's talk through that first and foremost, kind of what we saw.
Yeah, so most of Kansas saw rain, and that was for most of central and eastern Kansas. Northwest Kansas saw snow that changed over to freezing rain and then drizzle. And as we got further north from Kansas, we had all kinds of precipitation types. And so the hope is that we can help describe why we get rain versus snow when the temperature is only a couple of degrees apart. There's a lot of things that go on above the surface as well that really drive the kind of precipitation we receive. And so the layers of cold and warm air, they change as we get up with height. And so that really dictates what kind of precipitation we measure on the ground.
Sure, and that pattern that weather's following up in the Northeast, kind of unique when it comes to our state, right?
Well, it's actually a very systematic, a normal process that we call it a mid-latitude cyclone. So it's a low pressure that has winds spinning anticyclonically, anti-clockwise around the low. And what that does is that wraps warm air from the south, usually the Gulf, northward, and warm air always rises. So it wraps it out ahead of the low and then wraps it up and around, and it's usually lifting with height. And so it does the same with the cold air. It brings that cold air from the north and east, brings it westward, and wraps it around the west side of that low. And so you get these air masses literally spinning around each other at various heights, and that really helps dictate why we got rain, because we were south and east of the low pressure system. We were in what we call the warm sector. We were south of the warm front, but east of the cold front. And so we were the warmest at the surface, and that's why we saw rain.
In Manhattan, we're saying.
Right. Well, in Manhattan and most of Kansas.
Right. But those areas that did experience precipitation that was different from rain, we'll get into the different sort of precipitation types they saw and kind of define those a bit. But that wasn't the same for that region, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And as you got further north, we kind of crossed that warm front and got into a colder air mass at the surface, which helped dictate the fact that they didn't get snow purely. They saw more mixed precipitation. But when we go west, we cross that cold front, much deeper cold air at the surface, in that area saw snow. And so it's just all about your location with an association with that low pressure system and the fronts that are associated with it. But keep in mind that low is not stationary, right? The atmosphere's a fluid, everything's moving and everything's in motion. Kind of think of it as your bathtub. You can push your hand or pull your hand through the bathtub. It's going to move that water around your hand and it's going to backfill behind it. And so this atmosphere works the same way. This low pressure system kind of acted as your hand and pushed through and moved off to the north and east. So you don't stay in the same place during that storm system. So the warm front might go past you, and then you get a cold front, like we saw some snowflakes on Thursday morning. That's because the cold front went through, and it got colder at the surface and was allowing that moisture to fall as snow. And so just be aware of where you're at in relation to that storm system, and that'll help dictate what kind of precipitation you get.
Sure. And some other precipitation types we haven't talked about so far includes sleet and frozen rain. So let's define those a little bit and kind of differentiate between the two.
Yeah, so let's start with rain. Rain's super easy. The entire profile from the surface to the cloud, and maybe the cloud might be freezing, but when that precipitation falls, it accumulates droplets or ice. It gets heavy enough to fall. Gravity pulls it down, and it pulls it down through this thick layer of warm air. So it melts it. It melts it into a raindrop, and then, well, it's warm and above 32 degrees all the way to the surface, so it stays a raindrop and falls to the ground as a raindrop. That's rain. Pretty cut and dry. We get rain all the time. But when we start changing the profile, so let's introduce just a very, very thin layer of sub 32 degrees at the surface. So the surface is freezing, but the air just above it is warmer and all the way up to that cloud base. So that precipitation falls, melts to that warm layer, and then hits that cold layer, but doesn't have time to refreeze. So what happens is that ground is frozen then, and as that rain hits that ground, it actually freezes on contact. That's freezing rain. That's a very, very, very hard combination to get because that layer of cold air is so thin at the surface. If it's any thicker and we start to get a deeper cold layer at the surface with warm air still above it, then that precipitation will refreeze in that cold layer and will typically fall as sleet. So it'll freeze into these little balls, and they'll typically be clear. And that's important because we can also get graupel, which is cloudy, kind of like hail. That looks very similar. They're little balls, just like sleet. But when they're cloudy, it's more graupel and it's being mixed differently. And it's actually building and collecting more droplets as it falls because of buoyancy or turbulence in the atmosphere. So we're at sleet, little balls falling now. Typically, we see sleet a lot of times when freezing rain is forecasted because it's just so hard to forecast that thin layer of cold air. And you need to have the surface at freezing. If the ground's too warm or anything like that, it's hard to get freezing rain. Sleet will typically greatly reduce snow totals if snow's forecasted. So if we're expecting like 5 to 10 inches of snow and I walk out there and see sleet, I mean, I start cutting that expected snow total in half really quickly because it will greatly reduce any snow potential. So we have that cold layer. We can build that cold layer even deeper. And this is all arbitrary depending on how cold that layer is or how warm that layer is above it. But we can have a small, thin area of warm air still that could potentially not even allow that precipitation to melt completely, and then it would still fall as snow too. So once we have that whole profile as cold, below 32 degrees, we see snow, and we can get lots of different forms of snow as well.
All that variability when we think about precipitation types, it also affects us ag-wise when we think about the return of that to our soils, right? So when we compare, let's say, 10 inches of snow to 10 inches of rain, what does that look like for us?
Well, there's two ways to look at it. The first way would be just the time of year. Snow is really important because it slowly melts typically, and it gives that moisture a chance to soak into the ground. Whereas if we get rain in the wintertime like we have in Manhattan, we are at this point because we've had so much rain. But if it falls too heavy, it'll run off. It won't get absorbed because that ground could be frozen and not allow moisture into it. So it definitely doesn't help. We see erosion issues as a result. We'll see a plus in ponds and creeks, but it also has a lot more sediment in it too. So when we look at long-term benefits, snow is more helpful just because it soaks in the ground. Now, the amount of snow varies greatly in how much moisture it has in it. So we can have 10 inches of snow with a really cold period. Let's say, it's below zero and we get a lot of snow, which is hard to do in Kansas, but it is possible. That snow typically has a lot less moisture in it because cold air can't hold as much moisture. And typically when it's cold, the snow is much fluffier. It's very soft and tends to compact when it starts to melt. And so we'll see that 10 inches quickly become 5 inches, and there's a lot less. We can see snow ratios as much as 20 inches of snow is equal to 1 inch of moisture.
Wow.
That's a lot of snow for very little moisture when you think about just the impacts of it. Now, we can have, like this most recent storm event, parts of central Nebraska got 2 feet of snow. 24 inches of snow. That's a ton of snow. But the crazy thing is the temperatures are right around 30 degrees during this event. So the temperatures are really, really warm, which means that atmosphere can hold a lot more moisture. And so the chemistry and the dynamics of that snowflake are much different, and they hold a lot more moisture. So because it was warmer and held more moisture, that 24 inches could melt down to like 3 inches of precipitation, which is a ton of moisture in a snowpack. And that'll be much harder to melt too, because when it starts to melt, it compacts, becomes ice, and it's going to stick around a lot longer and have good benefits and bad benefits of snow on the ground. But so it just goes to show that we see different snowflakes, like we see needles and we see prisms and columns when it's really cold. So they look different. Snowflakes look a lot different when it's really cold. When they're wet and the temperatures are warmer, we see those big, giant, awesome snowflakes that could be like the size of your thumb. But if you look at one individual flake, they're perfectly shaped at times. They fracture and they break and all that. But so we get different snowflakes from that, and that's why we see different compaction and stuff too, because there's different moisture amounts in that snowflake.
So interesting just to know that a difference in temperature of 5 or 6 degrees in some cases could lead to bigger or smaller impact depending on the way you look at it. Crazy.
It is. And when we look at this most recent event, we have to consider that it could have potential impacts down the road, because when you get that much moisture and that much potential for ice, and that snowpack's going to last a lot longer to our north, which will have an underlying impact on temperatures and even precipitation trends over the next few weeks. So definitely a dynamic that one event can completely change a winter for a lot of folks. And this might have been that one event.
Absolutely. Well, Chip, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. We're obviously not done hearing from you today. It's a double feature day when it comes to hearing from you. So we're going to continue our conversation with our normal weather report. But thank you so much for joining us.
Now everybody's a snow spurt.
Now they are, though. Right? Once again, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond joining us for a conversation on winter weather types and what to expect from different types of systems. We'll be back with more from Chip ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're ending our week's programming with our agricultural weather report, and joining us for that, as always, is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. So, Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem.
So, let's start with a review of the last week. We got some precipitation across areas of the state.
Yeah, we had a very large dynamic storm system hit the Central Plains. We saw snowfall in the far northwest and northern parts of the state, and then moisture for a majority of the remainder of the state. The area where it was most sparse was in the southwest. They had some isolated areas of 1/10 of an inch. But as you got further east, especially central Kansas into the grand old Manhattan area, they just seem to win time and time again with moisture. We got about up to an inch of moisture, and definitely some needed moisture, a drop in the bucket. We look at long-term deficits, but it's definitely progress. And in fact, really the argument could probably have that Manhattan area at least is not in any drought categories anymore. We're still abnormally dry in the drought monitor that came out this week. It reflected no changes across the state, but we'll take every shot we can get, and we're slowly working towards progress.
Absolutely. And you hinted at this here, but we're still in Manhattan several inches behind in snow deficits. But that's not the case for one region of the state, right?
Yeah, Manhattan and 90% of the state are well behind on snow totals for the season, I should say. The Northwest is that one anomaly. Goodland up to about the Norton area and westward have seen multiple snow events and are average to above average. Depends on where you're at out there, but they average around 14 inches of snow this time of year, and so they're at or above that. But Manhattan and central Kansas is well below normal. We're sitting right around 2 inches of snow in the Manhattan immediate area, and honestly most of the rest of the state. And Manhattan averages around 17, 18 inches of snow, so we should be about halfway there at this point, and we're not. So a big turnaround will be needed to catch up on some snow. It only takes one event. This past storm system dropped over 2 feet of snow in central Nebraska from one 24-hour system. So it can happen, but we'll look forward in a minute, and I think we'll see that's probably not likely.
Yeah, I was about to say, let's talk about those outlooks that got released just yesterday. Not looking optimistic in that regard, right?
Well, yeah, we're going to see a change. We've been really warmer than normal to start the year, and we kind of leveled out to about average the last few days. And now we're going to start a period, especially after this weekend, of below normal temperatures. It's going to carry us through the rest of the month. We're not looking at like super cold, like zeros and below, but colder than normal by about 5 to 10 degrees potentially. We're actually on the upward swing of temperatures. We've hit our coldest average low temperature fell on the 18th, and that's about 19 degrees in the Manhattan area, and same for the rest of the state for the most part. But now we start climbing. We're starting to see those lows average higher. So colder temperatures means potential for snow, because when we get precipitation, it'll fall as snow, but unfortunately, we're kind of shifting back into that La Nina-like pattern where we get northwest flow that's typically colder, but also typically drier.
Sure. So averages we're reaching temperature-wise, but not precipitation-wise, potentially to come.
Precipitation-wise, we'll probably be on the lower end. We do have a storm system expected this weekend that'll likely drop some snow, especially in southwest Kansas where they really need it. And another small potential middle of next week. And we'll see that. We'll see small chances of snow, but overall, big, impactful system like we just had doesn't seem likely for the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Sure, but that doesn't mean that our active storm season is nothing to worry about, right?
Right, yeah. So the long-term outlooks include spring, and that just came out Thursday morning, and they really favor La Nina-like conditions. So previously in the last few months, our La Nina has been dominated by cooler weather, and so we'll see that aspect of it, but it'll shift towards more equal chances, even potentially warmer than normal as we get into the April and March time frame. And that's typically our really active period for fire weather, and we start to see the onset of severe weather. And with that La Nina look, it tends to bring that dry conditions up from the southwest into southwest Kansas and pushing into central Kansas. That would fuel strong dry lines that would result in pretty active severe weather season for eastern Kansas and potential fire weather for central and west.
So definitely something folks should be keeping an eye on in the coming months for sure.
Yeah, and especially as you transition, we actually saw La Nina weaken a little bit over the last month, and that's hopefully the start of weakening La Nina to neutral or even El Nino by the summer. And when we have a weakening La Nina in the spring, we typically see a very active storm pattern in the spring and thunderstorms and fire as a result.
Well, Chip, I can't thank you enough for this update, and hopefully listeners take this to heart and keep that in mind as we go into the weeks and months ahead. But thanks as always.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond joining us for our agricultural weather report. We'll be back with more next week on Agriculture Today.